In this video, we're going to be looking at the mechanism behind how the cells of the large intestine actually transport water from the undigested food of your large intestine into the capillaries that make up your circulatory system. So the difficult thing about transporting water is that water is actually very difficult for cells within the body to transport directly. And if you think about ways that your body gets rid of water, the three most common ways are sweat, in order to control your body temperature, and if you taste sweat, it tastes salty. Now, another example where your body releases water is every time you cry, and again, if you can recall the taste of human tears, most of the time people would describe them as being salty. The third example, of course, is urination, where your body gets rid of liquid waste, and while I would not encourage everyone to taste urine, most people would describe that urine has a very salty smell to it, and this is not accidental. So pretty much every time that water is transported from one location to another by the cells in your body, it involves the transfer of salt, and the way that your large intestines do it is that the cell membranes of the cells of your large intestine contain specialized transportation proteins, which are what we call Na+, K+ pumps. Now, for people unfamiliar with the chemical symbols, Na+ is the ion form of sodium, and K+ is the ion form of potassium, which is why we most likely refer to these as sodium-potassium pumps. And the job of a sodium-potassium pump is to take sodium ions, in other words, sodium ions from the salt that exists in your food, and transport them out of the space in your large intestine where your undigested food is, and into the capillaries that transport blood in and out of the intestines. And if we look at what happens at the atomic level, we can see something happening. So as sodium-potassium pumps work, the way that they work is they transport potassium ions out of your blood. This is not really relevant. The main goal here is that the sodium from inside of your large intestines is going to ultimately be transported into your blood. Now, what this means, if we look at the concentration of salt that exists in your blood and the concentration of salt that exists in your large intestine, as we transport sodium ions out of the large intestine and into the blood, the salt concentration in your large intestines is going to decrease, and the salt concentration in your blood is going to increase. Now, because salt is a solute rather than a solvent, this means that this process is going to be making your blood hypertonic. Now, if we remember what tonicity has to do with this, remember when we decrease the concentration of salt, that means that we are increasing the percent of the liquid in our large intestine that is water, meaning that this is effectively the high percent water side, meaning that water represents a greater percentage of the solution in your large intestine. And as we increase the amount of solute in your blood, that means that we are decreasing the percent of your blood that is water, and therefore this is going to be the low percent water side. So if we look at the direction where water is going to osmose, what this means is that because the sodium-potassium pumps in your large intestine are making your blood salty, if you will, by transporting sodium in, this creates a situation where water will want to osmose into the blood in order to dilute the concentration of salt. So in order to bring down the concentration of salt that exists within the blood. And this mechanism is identical to the way that transporting salt out of your skin causes you to sweat, and transporting salt out of your tear ducts behind your eyes actually causes you to cry. But the end result of this is that water from inside your large intestine is going to move into your blood, increasing the amount of water in your blood and therefore allowing you to recover the water from your food. Now, in the previous video, we addressed that this balancing act needs to be very, very tightly regulated, especially around the sigmoid colon, because if your large intestine absorbs too much water, or even worse, too little water, there are two excretion problems, let's just call them, that result from this process. For example, we'll actually start where if your large intestine absorbs too much water, what exactly does this mean? Well, in this situation, your large intestine will result in transferring most, if not all, of the water out of the large intestine. Now, as a consequence of this, if all of the water is transported, this is going to make the undigested food that you excrete, your feces, this is going to make it very, 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 very dry. And the problem about dry feces is that when the muscles of your large intestine contract to push the feces out, because the feces is dry, this is going to create extra friction during the process of defecation, which results in it being much harder to pass feces out of the anus. And this is actually a medical condition that we call constipation, which results when too much water is transferred from your large intestine into the blood, causing feces to become overly dry and therefore more difficult to pass due to extra friction. Now, you would think that the opposite problem is much better to have, but the opposite problem is actually even worse. Now, in this situation, instead of all of the water being transported from the large intestine into the blood, imagine that no water is transferred at all, meaning that all the water that you drink and all the water that you swallow from your saliva and is pumped into your stomach in order to dissolve your food, let's say that the large intestine can't recover any of that water. Well, if that water stays in your large intestine, that means that all of that water will be lost every time that you excrete feces out of the anus, meaning that in addition to losing the undigested food, your body is also losing a huge amount of water, which can cause very serious medical problems, including, but not limited to, causing your body to dehydrate. And if this continues to happen, for example, this condition can actually be caused by a number of poisons made by certain pathogenic bacteria. This can literally kill you due to water loss. And this condition, of course, is the opposite of constipation, what we call diarrhea. So if you had to choose between constipation or diarrhea, the correct answer is don't pick either of them because they are both bad in different ways. Although diarrhea more than likely is going to be more lethal than constipation because it results in an abnormal amount of water that is lost. Which brings us to the stool chart that we see here. So in the event that your feces is completely dry, meaning that there is no water present, this would result in extreme constipation, which chances are everybody has experienced in their lifetime at least once. And one way to reduce this problem is to make sure that your body is getting enough fiber in the food that you eat, which will allow feces to be passed much faster to prevent the recovery of too much water. Whereas on the extreme case here, this would be an extreme, possibly requiring hospitalization case of diarrhea, particularly if it occurs constantly at every meal, meaning that the ideal consistency, if you will, of your feces should be right around the middle here, where your body is absorbing enough water, but not too much water that it will make feces difficult to pass. This concludes the part of our instruction regarding the functions of the large intestine itself. In the next part of the video series, we are going to be looking at not what your large intestine does by itself, but what it does with the assistance of the many, many bacteria that take up residence inside of your large intestine.